The example 2.5, he used the forward slashes and the out print lines. And then can you go over next line?
Yep, that's page 95, right? Okay, so listing 2.5 on page 95. The backslashes, they precede double quotes. Double quotes normally end a string, so in order to make the double quote part of the string and not just end the string, they need to be escaped. So backslashes are there.
Okay, so it's including the quote in the print the output.
Correct. And next and next line, they both return a string. The difference is that scanner by default takes whatever it's given. Usually we're dealing with keyboard input, and divides things into tokens, which are basically, usually anyway, anything that's separated from everything else by a space. So it reads up until the first space, and that's the first token. Then it discards all the white space, reads up until the next space, that's the second token. The documentation that you can get to through the course website, the official Java documentation, specifically says that next gets you the next token as a string. So it's just one piece of what you're looking at. It won't have any spaces in it because that's what delimits tokens. Next line, on the other hand, reads up until the end of the line and gives you everything, except for that end of line character.
Because in the book it says next, it adds everything onto that same line. One of the examples.
Can you point to a page?
Yeah. Oh no, that was print line. Sorry.
Okay. So, one note about the tokenizing idea. Normally, next will get the next thing that's delimited by a space. However, you can change that, and the book mentions that under other input delimiters on page 99 and continuing on to page 100. So in this case, they say use 2 octothorpes, 2 pound signs as the delimiter. And if you type in a bunch of text, may or may not contain spaces, followed by 2 octothorpes, then some more stuff, it'll take everything up until the 2 pound signs as the first token, everything after those 2 pound signs and up to the next set of 2 pound signs as the next token, even if there are spaces in there. Other questions on the reading?
We have one on page 99. At
Okay.
the bottom, where it says funny W-O after R space. And it's using number signs as the number. And it says the following code will be the 2 strings funny O and R. That's curious why the 2 spaces not part of the R. Since the spaces in the delimiter.
Right. Okay, so that's another one of those nuances that Java has. After figuring out where the token ends, it performs the trim operation on the token, which is listed in that big table of what you can do to strings on page 86 at the very bottom. Returns a new string having the same characters as this string but with leading and trailing white space removed. So assuming that's not a typo in the book, it'll perform the trim operation on that string automatically, so it'll give you the characters in there.
But it doesn't have trim written in the code, so how does it know the trim?
That's something that Scanner does automatically. Scanner is kind of a wrapper around this stuff you're reading, so it does a lot of stuff that's hidden. But that's kind of odd behavior, so that might actually be a typo in the book. We can find out.
Because in the examples last week, I had to substring for the
we were doing something slightly different last week. So this will be more or less listing 2.6 on page 100. I'm going to take some shortcuts just to save time.
Real quick,
Yes.
did you post the grades up? Blackboard?
I have not posted the grades for homework 1 because it's not technically due until tonight. So I don't grade homeworks before the due date, just to be fair to everybody. I probably won't be up at midnight tonight. Otherwise, I probably graded at midnight tonight. Most likely I'll end up grading it tomorrow evening, and I'll post the grades as soon as I'm done. So, barring any unforeseen circumstances, the grades will be posted before next class. While I'm doing this, are there any other questions on the reading? Not dyslexic today. Always a good thing.
Does it matter if you have to print line before the input?
Java is sequential, so things that are listed first get executed first. I'm omitting the prompt because I already know what the program is expecting from me. But there's no dependency between a system.out.println statement and getting keyboard input. If I want to tell the user what I'm expecting from them, I'm more than welcome to. If I want the user to guess, I can do that too. Alright, so that's not this class. That's essentially the meat of the program on 2.6. There's a little bit more that does the normal reading tokens without changing the delimiter in the first half, but I'm just concerned with the changing the delimiter. The reason I'm putting angle brackets on either side of the string is so that I can see exactly what's in S2, because if I were to print out something with spaces at the end, it would look exactly the same as something without spaces on the end. So if there are spaces on the end of S2, that right angle bracket in line 10 will be off to the side a little bit. So let's enter that string It's a little small, but that is the test string. Of course, in their sample screen output, they don't add the spaces between RD and the 2 pound signs. So
So it does keep the space.
I think I only entered 1 space, so that's why there's only 1 space showing up there.
But it does keep it.
Does keep it, so it doesn't actually do the trimming. That's 2 spaces. There we go. So that is a typo at the bottom of page 99. But at the bottom of page 100, when they actually run the program, they don't add those extra spaces at the end of RD, at the end of the line. Oh, yes. All sorts of typos. The second to last line of the sample screen output at the bottom of page 100, the green text, I don't think the author meant to put an R before the 2 pound signs. So it's supposed to say WR pound pound RD to be consistent. Oh, yes. The 2 words are funny and WOR pound pound RD pound pound. Yes. So, a couple typos, but the concepts are still the same. The author is accurate in terms of those. And this is running right on Java, so this behavior is exactly what you should expect, regardless of what the book says. That's always a good way to figure out if the book is, if it's the book being confusing because there are mistakes, or if it's Java being confusing because Java does that sometimes. Take the listings and run them yourself and try them. Any other questions on the second half of Chapter 2? Or the first half of Chapter 2 even? Lingering questions from last class? So section 2.3 talks about input and output, specifically keyboard and screen input and output. In general, input, for now anyway, input comes from the keyboard, output goes to the screen. That's the only way that we're going to deal with input and output. Later on, we'll deal with file input and output, but right now everything goes from our fingers through the keyboard to the program and then gets spit back out to us through the screen. And we've already seen a significant portion of this chapter, or this section. This section really just explains a little more of the details behind it. And most of it is just examples. Somebody's having fun. Oh, geez. There's also a typo on the bottom of page 93 in the explanation of println versus print. I don't know what the spaces are doing between 1, 2, and 3 because they shouldn't be there. The difference between print and println is a very simple one. Println puts a new line at the end of whatever you pass to it. Print does not. That's the only difference between them. Other than that, they work exactly the same. You can give them whatever you want, and they will try to do something sensible with it. Println will put that line break there. Print will not. Using print is convenient if you want to print a bunch of stuff right next to each other, like the author is intending to do in that box on the bottom of page 93. And it can be useful to break up, if you want one long line of text, but you want to break it up in code so it's a little more readable, you can put the first section in a print statement, the next section in a print statement, and then the last section that's supposed to be on the same line in a println statement, and that'll handle the new line. Any questions on that?
Should the space be before or after the? Because like in here, definitely it's a typo. Those are spaces, but if you were really to do this, would the space be before 2 or after 1?
That's a good question. The Java answer is that it doesn't make any difference because the same characters are all there. It's really up to you. I guess in my code, I tend to put the space at the end of the preceding string. So it'll be 1 space, 2 space, 3. I just think it looks a little bit cleaner. It looks a little weird to look at the beginning of a string and see space and then stuff. It's like, did I really intend to put a space there? It really becomes an issue when you're writing strings that get used by something else that need that space to be there. That can get you into some trouble. So it's probably not a bad thing just to have that space at the end because it's pretty obvious. Yes, I meant this space to be here. And I'm going to skip ahead to the end of that section just to talk about to page 101. So there's println and print, both of which take a single argument and print something to the screen. Println follows it by a new line, print does not. There's another method in that family of methods that also prints stuff to the screen but does it a little bit differently. And this was added in Java 5. Starting with version 5, Java includes a method named printf. I am a C programmer. I learned programming using C. In C, the way to print stuff to the screen is through a method called printf. So I really like that Java now has a printf method. And one of the things that it's very nice about, one of the things that it does, that it makes a lot easier, is when we want to print, so in this lines 9 and 10, we have a string, then a variable, then a string, with plus signs in between. And if you start getting a lot of those in series, it gets really unreadable and really messy really quickly. Printf allows you to separate. This is a software engineering concept, but it applies here, to separate presentation from data. So the first argument to printf is the presentation part, a format string. The second half is a series of arguments which represent variables or values that should be placed into that format string at very specific places. And this is actually used in a very controlled case in the homework that's assigned today and due a week from today. So to convert lines 9 and 10 to something that uses printf, I'll start by moving the variable outside. So we know we want to print S1 in there somewhere. And inside format strings, all I forget what the book calls them. Format specifiers. Okay. All format specifiers begin with a % sign. Which, while we're here, we can say, well, what if I want to put a literal % sign in there? The format specifier for a % sign is 2 % signs. Basically, exactly the same way of escaping characters that \\/ enables you to put a literal / inside a string. But here I want to print out a string. And at the top of page 102, there's a list of common format specifiers. %C is the format specifier for a character. %D, strangely enough, is the format specifier for an int. %F is the format specifier for a float. In Java, a double. in every other language a float. Java uses double as the default floating point type, so %f means double. %e for exponential floating point number, that basically means print this out in scientific notation. And %s is for string. So here I want to print out a string. We'll put the format specifier for a string, and we'll change line 10 as well. And change the name of the method as well. That could help. We'll stay consistent with our input, and oh, great. So this is kind of what we expected and also kind of not what we expected. Printf, like print, does not add a new line to the end of the thing it prints out. So in order to do that, we need to add a new line character. Now we get the same output as before. Any questions on printf? Printf is one of those very subtly powerful things where once you start using it, I guarantee you'll end up with questions with it. After this assignment specifically has you using printf, and I actually give you the line to use, I believe. After this assignment, you're welcome to use whatever you want. If you're comfortable using printf and really like the power that it gives you, you can use that. If you find println and print easier to use, you're more than welcome to use that as well. They won't be required to use one or the other. You had a question?
Yeah. How come there's no field or
Field width?
Yeah.
So in this particular case, I did want to see exactly how much, how many spaces were at the end of RD. So I did want to force a field width on it. But a lot of times especially when you're doing floating point numbers, integers, they can be a wide range of sizes.
So you use the field mainly with integers and floating points, not strings and characters?
Right. Characters, they're always going to be one character long. So it doesn't really make sense unless you want to enforce that there's space. And that's really what the field width is there for. It says, this is how wide the field is. Make there be enough space that this is always the case. If the value that is going there takes up more characters than your field width is, it'll just spill over. And your nicely formatted line will no longer be nicely formatted. Field width specifiers and especially precision specifiers aren't useful all the time, and they're not required. All that's required is the % sign and the letter indicating what type is going there. How Java is supposed to interpret this value. Precision specifiers obviously don't make sense on things that don't have precision. So it doesn't make sense on an int. Really doesn't make sense on a string. Field specifier, the decimal point also, same thing. Field specifiers may or may not make sense depending on your application. And does the book mention the padding character? It doesn't look like it. There are also some other options to printf that give it a lot more power, but they also make it a lot more confusing. The full specification for Printf is available as a link from the course website. So here's a link to all of Java, and here's a link to the documentation of the printf method itself, and the documentation for format strings. And it starts close to the top of the page. There's all the possible format specifiers, and some more, and some more, and eventually the documentation ends somewhere. Yeah, it ends here. So halfway down the page. All right, more than halfway down the page. There is a lot to Printf. You don't need to know all of it in order to use Printf. What's explained in the book is more than sufficient, certainly for this class, and probably more than sufficient for most applications where you're going to use Printf. However, there are a lot more options that you can provide to Printf and do some pretty cool formatting with it. Questions?
Can you do an example of a list specifier and then just mess it up?
Yes. So let's start with, let's say the field width on this should be 4.
That's 4 characters now?
4 characters. Yes. So obviously the first one will spill over. Second one, it'll be perfect. So it looks exactly the same. Because strings, there's really no way of shortening them. The only way to truncate a string would be using substring or something like that. If I change this to, let's say, 6, that'll make the second one longer.
So if you make the width too long,
It will add characters in to satisfy that width. Let's do something with integers. How long should these be? Let's say 4. And the variables that are listed on the right, the second half of the printf arguments list, must be in the order that they appear in the format string. So I can't just add the integers at the end here. I do have to put them before the strings. There's A. There's B. So it doesn't matter when I assign them because they're not related at all. But when I call printf, the first format specifier must be the second argument. The second format specifier must be the third argument. I don't get a choice in that matter. So here the A spilled over. So my field width is 4, that number does not fit in 4 characters, so it spills over. The number 6, however, does, so it stays within 4 characters.
Is there a way to get to add spaces to the right-hand side?
There is. The book doesn't appear to mention it, and I don't remember offhand, but I think this is it. I think it's just as simple as adding a minus sign in front. Yes. So if you add a minus sign in front of the field width, it puts everything on the left. Left justifies everything. If it's a positive number, it right justifies everything. The reasoning for that is because most of the time field width specifiers are used with numbers, and normally numbers get right justified. This is something that, for example, Excel does by default. You type a number in a cell and it puts it on the right. You type a string in a cell, it puts it all the way to the left. Let's change these to floats. Let's change this one to, I think that's right. My Calc 2 teacher forced us to remember E to 15 decimal places. I can't forget E to 15 decimal places anymore. But in this case, it will be convenient because why did I make that float? I want that to be a double. Double. So we'll make it to 3 decimal places. Which means that A should print out 3.142. It takes the value and evaluates it to that many decimal places. So it's not like taking a string and chopping it off. It tries to get the most precise with the precision it's given. And that should make E be 2.718. Let's change this field width a little bit to give it some space. That field width covers both the integer part and the fractional part and the decimal point. So with 3 decimal places, it doesn't really make sense to have a field width smaller than 5. So it chops things off right where we'd expect it to. 3 decimal places, field width of 6. Let's make this.
So you decided a field width of 5.
It wouldn't have a space at the beginning. And if I had a field width of 4, it would spill over, which is more or less what I'm going to demonstrate here. Right. So now when I run this, the decimal places will not line up. Because in order to properly show A, it needs at least 7 places. In order to show A with 3 decimal places, it needs at least 7 characters. So the field width is supposed to be 6. It needs 7, so it spills over 1 to the right. Any other questions on printf? Again, don't worry too much about the mechanics of printf. I give you the format string for assignment 2, so understand how passing variables to printf works, and you should be okay. And if you don't want to use printf ever again, go right ahead. So now we can talk about input. And the discussion here, we've really already seen everything we need to know about getting keyboard input from a scanner. The only important thing here is the table on page 98. And in fact, we can pull up the even more extended table on the internet. Oops, too far. So the table on page 98 is really just a, well, that didn't work, an abbreviation of the list of all the methods that are in the scanner class, starting with next and going all the way down to next short. Basically, scanner has a method to get the next insert type here. So if you want a long, there's a method to get the next long. If you want an int, there's a method to get the next int. If you want the next byte, there's a method to get the next byte. Floats and double, there's a method to get those too. The main thing to watch out for here is that scanner does not look through what you give it until it finds the next string that can be converted to that type. It takes the next token and tries to convert it into that type. It tries to cram it into that type. If it doesn't work, it blows up. And when I say blows up, I mean seriously blows up. So let's change these to ints. And we might as well make sure everything works properly. We'll change this to int. We'll change this to int. And let's pretend we have no idea that we changed those to ints and give it strings. Now, remember, use delimiter is still on. So it explodes. And the basic error is input mismatch exception. Basically, I was looking for an int and you gave me a string. I don't know what to do. Let's run it again. And this time we'll give it an int followed by a word. It's difficult to see because we don't print out what we got immediately after we get it, but we can see where it broke. This happened at delimitersdemo.main line 8. So I'm glad you asked. That was exactly where I was going. Delimitersdemo.java is the file name, and 8, the number following the colon, is the line number. And the easiest way to determine that is anything that says native method, delegating method, method.java. I don't know what that is. Java compiler, I didn't write that. So anything that looks like something I didn't write is probably not where it's breaking. Especially if you're only using the Java framework. The Java framework is pretty bug-free, except for serious security vulnerabilities like that infinite loop thing that happened a year ago. But here, there's only one line that lists a file that I have written, that I have had anything to do with. So it's a pretty good chance that that's where the issue is. Delimiters demo.java line 8. So it broke here. So we can tell that it was able to pull n int out of the scanner, which makes sense because the first token I gave it was a 6, but the second one it broke on. So let's run it again and let's not try to break it this time. Questions?
You need the line break with the part.
Do you need the line?
After you're out right now, it says,
So it doesn't matter what is the rest of the format string in a printf. If I want a line break at the end of what I'm printing, I need to put it there.
okay, so if you got rid of that first, that backslash n, you just
It would
put the line right next to it.
put everything here right next to the 6. Yep.
And then you're gonna need that second new line at the end of your code then. Your code, or
You do still need it. Some systems try to be helpful and automatically put a new line at the end of your program's output if you don't already have one there. Most systems do not. So if you're running this from a prompt, it ends up with your prompt right at the end of the output. Looks really ugly. And that's before when I ran the program and I first put those, when I first had Printf, it put the angle brackets right next to each other, and then there was this other angle bracket, and that's why I paused for a minute, because I was like, wait a minute, where's that other angle bracket coming from? It's the prompt. Dr. Java uses an angle bracket as the prompt. What else? So there's an interesting nuance that occurs when you're combining next some type or even just next and something like next line. Next anything other than line just gets the next token and doesn't read any more white space. So if, for instance, I gave this input and I made a line here that said, I guess we'll want to declare that, string s3 equals keyboard dot next line. As soon as I hit the enter key, scanner starts processing. As soon as it reads 2 tokens, it stops processing. So I've hit enter. There's still a new line character there. Even if I try to type another line afterward, next line is going to go up until the first new line that it sees, which is at the end of the line that I've just typed. So let's go ahead and print that out. Let's not do that. Let's just hit enter. Oh, right. Next line doesn't care about token delimiters. It just looks for the next new line character. So let's make this slightly less confusing and get rid of this use delimiter thing. Or as it might be more confusing, but the nuance will be more obvious this way. So 6, 4, enter. Rest of line, nothing. I don't have an opportunity to type anything else. And this becomes a little more obvious if I were to do something like this. Typos aside, that's exactly what happens. So it goes up until that new line. Notice that I used system.out.println, and which automatically adds a new line character to the end of the string I give it. And I said that S3 should contain the rest of the line. The rest of the line does not contain the new line character. So it reads up to and including the new line character, and then discards the new line character and staves everything else into the string. So this is convenient for getting each individual line from standard input, for instance. So if I wrote a program specification that said get a list of names from standard input and print them out, I could do keyboard.next line on each line, and I would get just the name and not the new line character divided the name. Questions on that?
But there's still a character in the like the backslash n that line, right? That hasn't been read yet. Like, because we didn't read the next line. So there's still a backslash n.
At this point, next line has read to the end of that line.
I'm sorry, yes. Right. So if you had just tried next, then it would be backslash.
Then yes, that would be. Then technically there would be stuff that was provided to standard input that was not processed by the program, which in general I guess is bad, but it doesn't really affect anything. So that concludes our discussion of input and output for now, anyway. Section 2.4 talks about documentation and style. And this falls under the heading of convention and philosophy and stuff that's good to do. And I've already mentioned kind of in passing a lot of these concepts. The first one they mentioned is meaningful variable names. You can tell I don't adhere to this. And what's kind of ironic is the author doesn't adhere to this either. But if you intend your code to be able to be read by anyone else and you 3 months down the road, you should have meaningful variable names. I can tell you from experience, writing code, putting it away for 3 months, looking at it again when it doesn't have meaningful variable names is like smashing 2 bricks into your head. It doesn't make any sense at all. I think I've already mentioned my philosophy as to why I use single letter variable names, or at least the joke that I tell people. If your block of code has more than 26 variables, you're doing too much. The fact of the matter is that I'm lazy. Laziness is no excuse. I don't pretend to say that my single letter variable names are a right way to do them. They're not. Meaningful variable names, they are long to type, they are tedious to type. There's a lot of room for spelling mistakes, but luckily Java will complain at you if you misspell a variable name. But they are very helpful in making your code readable. And gets dangerously close to the idea of self-documenting code, which is a good thing that the author moves right from meaningful variable names to comments, because there is no such thing as self-documenting code. You might think your code is the most elegantly constructed program in the world with the most meaningful variable names. Everything is very descriptive as to what it does. Someone, probably you 3 months from now, will not understand what you're doing. So comments are a good thing. Java has 3 types of comments, and I think I've already mentioned these, but it bears repeating. The first type of comment starts with 2 slashes and goes to the end of the line. The next line is not part of the comment. This is useful for kind of line-by-line commenting inside blocks of code. The second type of comment is a slash followed by an asterisk. Begins with a slash followed by an asterisk, immediately no white space in between, and ends at an asterisk followed by a slash. And everything in between is part of the comment. These are good for the tops of your source files, the tops of methods, large blocks of text that look like narratives. If you're writing a book in your code, use this type of comment. That said, if you're writing a book in your comments, don't. And then the third type of comment is very similar to the second type of comment, but it starts with a slash and then 2 asterisks. And that's a very special type of comment called a JavaDoc comment. There's a program called JavaDoc that reads through your program looking for this type of comment and some other notation that we won't get into, and automatically generates documentation for your program.
Is there a specific reason why you would use JavaDoc?
There is a very good reason why you would use JavaDoc, and it's basically so you can generate documentation that looks like the official Java documentation. It's designed so that you can comment your code exactly the way you should already be commenting your code. Run this program on it, and it will generate documentation for the program. It'll tell you how to interface with your program, what the program does, all these sorts of things. And the syllabus talks about these specific elements that should be in your program. You don't have. There are 2 comment blocks listed on the syllabus. You don't have to worry about the second comment block yet because we haven't talked about methods. That'll happen about halfway through the summer. No. That'll happen about a third of the way through the summer. But that first comment block, which tells useful information like who you are, what programming assignment it is, what day it is, what class this is for, those sorts of things, those are very important. And there are, I would say, probably 3 good uses for comments. Several more bad uses for comments, but 3 good uses for comments. I might add a 4th to that. I might group 1 and 2 into 1. So the first type is general comments about your program. So author, generally what it does, that sort of thing. The second type is comments about a method. Briefly, comments are smaller pieces of your program that do very specific tasks and hopefully do them well because they don't have to worry about other things. We will talk about them in much greater detail later on in the semester, but that's the second type of comment. The third type of comment is a comment about a line that either does something clever, does something tricky, does something non-obvious. You might say, this is an implementation of some other algorithm. Go look at the documentation somewhere else. Do not use comments that look like this. This does not tell me anything about the line. If I know anything about Java, I can already tell, 1, that I'm storing something in S1, 2, that I'm getting input from the user, and 3, that they're connected in some way. Comments should add something that's not immediately obvious from the source code. So on this line, I might say any more than 3 decimal places is overkill. That's a helpful comment. 3 decimal places might, this number might come from a calculation somewhere else where any places after that are not significant. Or I really don't care if they're significant. too precise for my application. And the fourth type of comment, which is kind of put this in parentheses, put stars around it, say this is not a permanent type of comment, is to get rid of code that you don't want the compiler to compile and execute. In fact, there is a very good example of that right here, line 5. I commented out that line because I didn't want that to happen. Special note about this use of comments is that once you're done figuring out what works, what doesn't, what you want the program to do, and what you don't want the program to do, anything that's like that, get rid of it. Or mark it with some other comment that says, this is in here because this is necessary to debug the program, or this makes it easier. Something like that. I've had programs where most of the file ends up being comments just because I started writing something, it didn't work out, commented that out, pulled some pieces that did work and put them below it, and built a whole other algorithm that didn't work out, commented that out, and kept doing that several times. And then most of my source file is comments and this little bit of code. When you're done figuring out something that works, get rid of all those comments. Questions on comments and when not to use them. The next thing the book talks about is indentation. This is more a convention than anything else. Java does not care about your indentation. You reading your code might care a lot about indentation. Indentation makes code a lot easier to read. And usually it corresponds to how deep your blocks are missing. So here, this is the top level thing. Public class delimiters demo. It is not indented. Everything inside of it is indented. The first thing that's inside of it is a method. That's another block. Everything inside that method is further indented. In a couple classes, we'll get to, possibly even the next class, we'll get into things that involve more nesting of blocks. Each thing gets nested a little bit more. The convention is usually to use 4 spaces. Dr. Java's convention is to use 2. It's really not that big a deal, as long as you're consistent. The biggest thing about conventions is pick one and stick with it. As long as you're consistent with your conventions, it really doesn't matter what they are. Along with this idea of indentation, I'll mention the braces issue. There are tons of conventions regarding placement of curly braces. It's nauseating to see how many different standards and conventions there are with regard to curly braces. I can tell that the author is a C programmer because he uses one of the most widely used C curly brace conventions. It's also the convention that I use. This is the convention that Java uses, putting the curly brace on the same line as whatever defines what the block is. And I will try to stick to this. Being a C programmer, I might fall into the other convention periodically, especially if I'm copying something out of the book. This is the way Java tends to do things, and all of the Java source code, you'll find this convention used. I won't take off points if you use one convention over the other. Pick a convention that works for you and stick with it. Sometimes teams have conventions, and that gets irritating if their convention doesn't match with your convention. My business partner and I have that issue. He uses this convention in everything that he does. I use the book's convention in everything that I do. When we're working on code together, the conventions are mixed. It's not good. I don't recommend it. The next thing the book talks about is named constants. And I think I mentioned this last time when I talked about variables. They're a very special type of variable that takes a value once and you can never change it again. And there are a couple things to note about named constants. The first thing is that they are not inside the main method. They are at the class level. So they're indented 2 spaces instead of 4. And second thing, they are a variable. Third thing, by convention, they are given names that are all caps. And since when every letter is a capital letter, it's very hard to differentiate between words, underscores are used to separate words. Pi is a single word, so we don't have to worry about that. In addition, there are some modifiers that make it a constant. The important one is final. That means this can never change. No. So don't ignore this. This is a method, so it has a completely different declaration. Public static. We won't talk about the effect of either of those quite yet. We'll talk about them later on in the semester, but they are also part of the definition of a named constant that we won't worry about for the time being. Named constants are useful. They're exactly what they sound like. They give a name to a constant value. If instead of putting the literal 3.1415927 into our code, we can put pi every place that we use the number pi. And if pi were to ever change, we'd only have to change it in one place. The book talks about apparently some states have redefined pi. There is legislation that defines pi to be less precise than it actually is, which is just beyond stupid. I hope Colorado's not one of those states. But seriously, that's way beyond stupid. That's beyond a tomato is a vegetable and not a fruit. It's I don't pretend to understand politics, even though I was involved with it for a time.
You say constants were not variables?
Constants are variables. They're a very special type of variable. And it looks like that's it for Chapter 2, since we're not dealing with the graphic stuff. Any questions on anything we've covered so far, really? Chapter 2, Chapter 1?
I have a question about the delimiters.
Yes.
It seems to boggle my mind. Why did you use them?
So the one of the in-class exercises for today will actually use delimiters.
Okay.
Last class when I gave exercises from the book and sort of a puzzle, I realized that I kind of liked giving a puzzle. Again, there's nothing graded about them. There's nothing that says you have to do them. It's just I'm trying to make this fun for you guys and fun for me too. Thinking up puzzles, I find enjoyable. I'm a nerd. What can I say? So when we reconvene, we can break a little bit early today because I finished talking early. But I do have a programming, or not a programming assignment. All the programming assignments that will ever be assigned are already posted on the course website. The book calls them programming projects. I'm not using the self-test questions because they're kind of like, ask yourself if this is right. Look in the book and say yes or no. It's not, you can't really put this stuff into practice. It's good for review, good for making sure you understand the material, But for in-class lab exercises, I'll choose things from the programming projects at the end of the chapters. So I picked one of those, and I have a sort of puzzle. So any other questions before we break? So in approximately 10 minutes, I will have on the screen a skeleton for the puzzle and the number of the page number and project number for the programming project. Again, you're welcome to do it. You're welcome to not do it. You're welcome to start and never finish. You're welcome to work on the homework that's due today. You're welcome to work on the homework that's due next week. We have covered all the material. No, we haven't. We have covered most of the material, all except one thing that you will need to do programming assignment 2. And the one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is a little method called math.pow. So this chapter talks about, it uses some radius and multiplication and squaring things, but it just takes radius and multiplies it by radius to accomplish radius squared. One of the examples deals with area of a circle. And this assignment deals with area of a circle as well. However, it's a lot easier to do something like math.pow. The first argument is the base, and the second argument is the exponent. So to square something, for instance, a radius, we say radius and then 2. And it returns a double. So something like that would give you the radius squared, assuming radius already existed. Does that make sense to everyone? The book doesn't actually talk about all the power that the math class gives to you until about halfway through the book. But this is one of those things that it's so important, especially if you're going to deal with areas of circles, that I might as well mention it now. Yes?
Did we have to use it for the hearing?
There are ways not to use it. You do not have to use it. I won't. I think the programming assignment might say use math.pow. If it doesn't, you don't have to do it. If it specifically says use math.pow, use math.pow.
This is going to make it a lot easier.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, it will. Especially when you start cubing things, because there's a volume formula in there which has radius cubed. So it'll be easier to do math.pow radius comma 3 as opposed to radius times radius times radius. Any other questions? Cool. Break time.